Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We appreciate you taking the time for this training, Anxiety, the Educator's Role in Supporting Students and Their Families. My name is Andy Hernandez and I'm a social worker, and I've been supporting schools for over 15 years. And now my colleagues will introduce themselves.
Hello, my name is Gisela Mendizabal, and I have been supporting schools for over 10 years.
Hello, everyone. My name is Karen Capraro, and I've been supporting schools for over 15 years.
There is no sign-in sheet for your attendance today, so to get a certificate for attending this 60-minute webinar, you'll need to fill out the survey at the end of the webinar, and it takes about 2 weeks to receive your certificate of attendance. Next slide, please. First, we'll start by reviewing a few webinar protocols. So all attendees will be muted to minimize noise for everyone. We value the knowledge and experiences you're bringing here with you today. And so we've built in activities throughout the training so that we can all learn from each other. Some of these activities may be easier to participate in if you're joining us from a computer or laptop. But if you're unable to join in the activities today, you can still learn a lot through listening, and we appreciate you being here. Next, we want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted for later viewing. If you experience any technical issues, please send a message to Felicia in the chat. And if we experience any issues on our end, we'll pause and try to get those resolved quickly. Next slide, please. This slide describes our program. I'm not going to spend too much time on this information so that we can have more time for the main content. BCH&P is a school-based behavioral health program in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Boston Children's Hospital, and this is our 21st year working in partnership with Boston Public Schools. Next slide, please. The Training and Access Project, or TAP, is an initiative within BCH&P that provides services focused on building the capacity of school communities to address social, emotional, and behavioral health. Next slide, please. This is the list of trainings we'll be facilitating over the school year, and we'll share this list again at the end of the training along with a link to the landing page where you can register. Next slide. As we create each training, we keep in mind the core concepts you see on the slide. These are self-awareness, adult learning principles, person in the environment, partnering with families, culturally responsive lens, and anti-racist practices. And depending on the training topic, some of the core concepts may be more heavily focused on than others. And if you would like to read more about our core concepts, we will provide a link to our landing page at the end of today's webinar, and there you can find more information. Next slide. Community commitments help to create a safe and supportive environment for people to participate in. For this webinar series, our community commitments are the following. We will commit to ending on time, recognizing that each of you is taking time from your professional and personal lives to be here. And we invite you to attend to your needs at any time. Everyone can learn from what you share. We'll be using Slido to invite you to participate today. We won't be able to highlight all responses that are shared today, but you will receive all of the Slido responses to review after the training. And you're also welcome to reach out to us after the webinar. We believe that differences of opinion can be useful as we can learn and grow from them. So we encourage you to be open to ideas or points of view that are different from your own. Please share airtime and allow everyone the opportunity to share. We ask you to please be mindful of confidentiality. Everyone is welcome to share their experiences, but we want to remind everyone that this is a recorded webinar. The webinar will be posted and viewed later by others, so please only share information that you're comfortable with having live in a public space. Next slide. For our check-in today, we're asking you to share what is your favorite relaxation or grounding activity. So take a moment to think about your response. Next slide. And we invite you to share in Slido. You can access Slido by scanning the QR code on the slide or by clicking on the link that has been put in the chat. We'll be using Slido throughout this webinar, so we invite you to leave it open in a separate tab for quick access. So I'm going to give a little bit of time for folks to get their responses in. I see 2 people talking about going on walks, reading, facials and massages, reading and cleaning, remembering to breathe, going on walks, listening to music, and meditation. Great responses. Thank you for sharing those. Those were fun to read. Next slide, please. So here's what you can expect in today's webinar. We will first share the purpose of today's webinar as well as the learning objectives. We will talk about the prevalence of anxiety. We will look at self-awareness and the role of culture and invite you to reflect on your identity and how this can contribute to what you bring to your practice and your understanding of anxiety. We will discuss behavior as a form of communication and different manifestations of anxiety. Throughout the webinar, we have clips from our documentary, Managing Anxiety in Childhood and Adolescence, information for parents and caregivers. So you'll get to hear students and families share their stories and experiences. We will also be featuring clips from our Educator Roundtable when we discuss strategies. We invited 3 educators to talk about the strategies they use to support students who struggle with anxiety. We recorded their conversation and will be showing clips in this webinar. There will be no breakout room in today's webinar. We really wanted to center the voices of the educators in the roundtable and give enough space to highlight the strategies they discuss, so we're featuring more of those clips in our webinar today. And to close the webinar, we'll summarize key points from the training and share resources. Next slide, please. And I'll now turn it over to Karen.
Thanks, Sandy. So let's start with our purpose and learning objectives for today. The purpose of this webinar is to discuss ways that anxiety can manifest in children and adolescents, how this is affected by culture, and what supports might look like in schools. Our learning objectives for today, number 1, gain an understanding of the different ways that anxiety can manifest in children and adolescents in schools. 2, reflect on how culture can shape understanding and perceptions of anxiety. And 3, learn about strategies educators utilize when working with students and their families who struggle with anxiety. Next slide, please. So why does this training matter? We know that students spend many of their waking hours at school, and educators are in a unique position to support students who may be struggling with anxiety. Educators have expressed training needs in mental health, specifically anxiety. Anxiety can be expressed in many different ways and can look different from student to student, so it can be hard to identify. Literature tells us that educators are more likely to recognize externalizing behaviors such as aggression, lack of self-control, and dysregulation rather than internalizing behaviors such as anxiety. Early detection is so important because implementation of strategies can reduce symptoms. Research on educating and training school professionals in the identification of anxiety is critical to increasing early detection and treatment. We know that consistent, supportive relationships between students and educators can be a protective factor for youth. Literature suggests that youth are more likely to access services when school professionals are aware of their anxiety rather than parents or other adults. These statements on the slide are from a few of the many articles that highlight the importance of the relationship between educators and students and the impact that they can have on students' mental health. Next slide, please. Anxiety is one of the most common behavioral health disorders among youth and adolescents, and the literature suggests it has doubled since the pandemic. The current literature has gaps with anxiety statistics post-pandemic. However, trends have remained stable, although some childhood behavioral disorders have increased, specifically depression among adolescents. Prior to COVID-19, global estimates for depression and anxiety, 2 of the most common mental health conditions of childhood, were estimated to be 8.5% for depression and 11.6% for anxiety. The literature suggests significantly higher rates for clinically significant depression and anxiety for children and adolescents, a more than 2-fold increase in prevalence rates compared with those reported prior to the pandemic. Anxiety disorders are common in youth, both in 12-month prevalence estimates from the general population and across the lifespan. Research indicates that 10 to 20% of children in the general population and primary care settings report distressing levels of anxiety. Lifetime prevalence for adolescents aged 13 to 17 for anxiety is 31.9%, with the median age of onset at 6 years of age. For students with anxiety, more than 1 in 3 also have behavior problems, and 1 in 3 also have depression. 6 in 10 students with anxiety receive treatment. Many students with anxiety go unnoticed due to their presentation. There's also stigma associated with mental health treatment. There are other barriers to treatment, such as long wait lists and high costs. A recent survey of high school students published by the Education Week Research Center in their October 2023 newsletter showed that the top reason that students miss school in the past year, besides physical illness and bad weather, is anxiety. And we all know that the need for effective preventative services and access to treatment has never been greater. Next slide, please. There are risk factors for anxiety that include a number of potential origins, including temperament. There's greater risk for students whose caregivers have behavioral health disorders, and the social determinants of health and systemic racism are significant risk factors for anxiety-related disorders. A recent report in January of 2023 demonstrating the evidence of the link between racial discrimination and anxiety disorders found that anxiety-related disorders were the most significant mediator for daily discrimination and suicidal thoughts, above both depression and substance use. Systemic racism puts people of color at a higher risk for anxiety disorders than white people. Clinical case examples provide lived evidence of diverse racial and ethnic individuals suffering from anxiety-related disorders, with the development and worsening of symptoms due to racism and microaggressions. Students from low-income families also are less likely to be diagnosed, to receive treatment, and have less access to care and resources. Next slide, please. And now I will hand it over to Gisela.
Thank you, Karen. During our self-awareness training, we took the time to unpack what we mean by this concept in depth. As we start this training, we want to establish common language and contextualize the concept of self-awareness as it relates to the topic for today, anxiety. We define self-awareness as the ability to accurately recognize one's emotions and thoughts and their influence on behavior, including accurately assessing one's strengths and limitations and possessing a well-grounded sense of confidence and optimism. Self-awareness helps us understand how we interpret others' social, emotional, and behavioral health. We know that students experiencing stress have the capacity to locate and activate unresolved issues in our own personal lives, and few of us possess the inner peace to respond in a calm and professional manner without making a conscious effort. This is why awareness of our primary emotional triggers improves our chances of making rational decisions that we can control, rather than letting our impulses take the lead in ways that do not align with the kind of educator we aspire to be. Increasing our self-awareness is important because relationships are the foundation of any strategy that we utilize with students. If we do not nurture ourselves, we cannot build meaningful relationships with students, and no strategy will work. Next slide, please. Let's take a moment and see if you can recognize how anxiety presents in the classroom. We invite you to connect to Slido for this activity. If you left Slido open, it should advance to this next question, or you can access Slido by putting your camera over the box and clicking on the link that comes up, or by clicking on the link in the chat. As you look at this list of situations that may be caused by anxiety, make sure to check all the options that apply. Thank you, everybody, for participating. Just make sure, remember, you can check more than one and just think about which ones could be caused by anxiety. So like it looks like the first couple of ones, people are thinking it's going to be more like the squirming in the seat, refusing to go to school, you may be avoiding to participate. Maybe those seem to look more like anxiety. Yeah, and then, some people are changing their minds too. Yeah, like maybe some are more anxiety, some we're not quite sure. Thank you, everybody, for participating. Yeah, the first two, it sounds like they clicked in. We know that based on your own lens and the experiences you have had, you are more likely to recognize and label some behaviors as anxious, such as when a child is feeling nervous before a test at school. Other times, anxiety in the classroom can look like something else entirely. an upset stomach, disruptive or angry behavior, ADHD, or even a learning disorder. There are many different kinds of anxiety, which is one of the reasons it can be hard to detect it in the classroom. What all types of anxiety have in common, says neurologist and former teacher Ken Schuster, PsyD, is that anxiety tends to lock up the brain, making school hard for kids experiencing anxiety. All of the examples in the exercise could have had anxiety as the underlying factor. We engage in this activity in hopes that the next time you notice a student behavior that may be making school hard for them, you can consider what is the meaning behind the behavior and what the student is trying to communicate. They may be trying to communicate that school is hard for them, and a form of anxiety may be one of the causes. So it's not only the first two, but actually all of them could have been anxiety. Next slide, please. We now want to talk about the role of culture and why it matters in the context of discussing anxiety. An individual's unique expertise and their experiences in and out of the classroom contribute to their understanding of anxiety. As we spoke about when talking about self-awareness, it is important to reflect on how our individual experiences help shape the way we understand and interact with students and their families. As we discussed during the self-awareness training, culture is about our families, the values, beliefs, traditions, and behaviors that have been passed down for generations. Our culture also informs the beliefs and values we hold around social-emotional health and well-being. Since our culture is something that from early on in our lives shapes our views, our perceptions, and our choices, this is true for how a person names, makes sense of, and navigates mental health. Culture can influence what we call anxiety, how we experience it, how we express it, and the interventions or treatment may look different depending on a student's culture. Since the culture we identify with is different from the one the students and families we support belong to, it is not enough to learn how anxiety is generally experienced in different cultural groups. We need to start with ourselves and be aware of the different traditions, beliefs, and values that we hold when talking about anxiety, so as not to let our lens get in the way of responding to the beliefs and values the families we work with have. Next slide, please. So let's take a moment and see a clip from our documentary, where we will learn from a mom, Nancy, and a young adult, Yvette, talk about the messages their cultures share regarding anxiety.
I was born and raised in Guatemala. He, comes from Puerto Rico. And so when we were growing up, anxiety was not even a word. And we know that it existed, but we didn't talk about it.
Yeah, so in the Latino culture, we don't really talk about mental health. We don't, again, like anxiety, any of the mental health topics aren't necessarily spoken about. And it has such a negative stigma, I'm very grateful that when I told my mom that I've been going to therapy, she was very glad that I had been doing that. And so I didn't tell her until way later because I also didn't want her to worry. And so I've been grateful that she has my support and is like, everybody, we all need to go to therapy now. And she's, saying that to the family.
As we just heard from Nancy and Yvette, a person's culture and upbringing influences the names we use or not use for anxiety. Recognizing that there are different words and labels used to talk about anxiety, even when individuals may come from the same cultural group, can help us remember to always ask families to define for themselves what anxiety means and not rely on general knowledge about how certain cultural groups may experience anxiety. Every person has their own cultural understanding of anxiety. Next slide, please. Just like we asked Nancy and Yvette to share, we now want to give you the opportunity to reflect on the messages the culture each of you is a part of has shared and how those messages have influenced how you describe anxiety. So please take a moment now to think about what words or names you or your family use to describe or talk about anxiety. This can be a word or this can be a sentence or sentences. When you're ready to share, you write it down on Slido. I already see some people writing, thank you. And we're gonna create a word cloud to highlight how there can be many names for one concept. If you see the word or words that you were going to write, add them and they will get larger. So we invite you to share your responses. Let me see what we can see. So the nerves, worried gets repeated more. Yeah, annoyances, stress, distraction, definitely. And remember, if you see something that like resonates, you can make it too. Nerves is repeating in a lot of different places. And irritated also. Hidden, interesting. Yeah, so maybe it's not something that was talked about. Thank you, everybody. We hope this activity highlights how our cultural lens and values in our family can shape our understanding and expression of anxiety. In trying to support a student who struggles with anxiety and partner with their family, it's important not to generalize. Be curious, ask questions. Asking families about their lived experience could provide important insight as to whether certain cultural differences are true for the family. It's also important to engage in two-way learning. Understand what is the family's perspective and share yours. At times, it's helpful to partner with people in the family's culture, such as cultural brokers, elders, interpreters, spiritual leaders, and non-traditional healers, who can provide social and cultural context and help connect the family to services. Next slide, please. I will now turn it over to Andy.
Thank you, Gisela. So before we talk about common anxious behaviors, it's first important to talk about what is behavior and what it tells us. And this is an important prerequisite to talking about supporting anxious behaviors at school, because in order to intervene effectively and sensitively, we need to try to understand what is motivating a behavior. So we can look at student behavior through the lens of behavior as a form of communication. And what we mean is that all behavior is purposeful and in an attempt to solve a problem. And this is true regardless of how a behavior may look, disruptive, unusual, etc. So our thoughts and feelings frequently manifest through our behavior. And this is especially true for children who have a hard time exercising impulse control and struggle with expressing feelings and thoughts through words. So think back to the activity Gisela just led you in, where you were asked to try to recognize the behaviors that are anxious behaviors. All behavior is functional. It serves a purpose. It's rarely simply behavior. There may be some underlying need that a student does not know how to express appropriately. Behaviors such as crying, screaming, running, hiding, and many others are all ways of communicating. Next slide, please. So on the previous slide, I shared that behavior serves a purpose and is typically motivated by some need that a student is attempting to meet. The function of a behavior is the reason an individual behaves in a certain way. So on the slide are two common functions of behavior, and these are to obtain or to get something, or to escape or avoid something. And this includes tangibles, attention, and sensory stimulation. So individuals behave in a way that help them to get some kind of benefit. Examples are avoiding a situation that makes them uncomfortable, getting noticed in the classroom, or getting help from an adult. So often when trying to determine how to intervene with a student's behavior, we first try to identify what the need of the student might be. Staff often have to make a quick assessment of why a student is exhibiting a behavior and then respond to it based upon that quick assessment. And this is easier to do with students who don't have any behavioral health challenges because their behavior tends to follow more predictable patterns. But with students who have behavioral health challenges, such as anxiety, it can be more difficult to quickly assess the behavior and identify the need. Often students with behavioral health challenges can behave or react in ways that might not feel appropriate given the event that has occurred. So in order to learn more about the function of behavior of students who struggle with anxiety, we need to partner with staff, school-based clinicians, and families, and collectively take on a detective role. We'll need to work as a team to ask questions, collect data, and identify patterns. And we can then look at this information as a team and try to determine supports that make sense for that student. So there will be a handout summarizing information about behavior as a form of communication in the Google folder that we'll share at the end of the training. Next slide, please. The American Psychiatric Association defines anxiety as a normal reaction to stress. Anxiety refers to anticipation of a future concern and is more associated with muscle tension and avoidance behavior. And this is just one definition of anxiety, and definitions can vary. So we all experience some level of anxiety. It's a normal response to stress or danger, and its function is to help keep us safe. It's problematic when it becomes overwhelming or starts to interfere with daily life. So it's common to confuse stress and anxiety, but there are some marked differences between the two. Stress is typically a reaction we have to something in our lives that we feel we have at least some power to manage. But with anxiety, our feelings do not always have a clear cause. So according to the American Psychological Association, anxiety is when an individual has persistent or excessive worries that don't go away, even when there are no triggers or stressors present. The fears and worries are not temporary and can get worse over time. And there's an impact on a person's functioning. So anxiety can affect how a person thinks, feels, and behaves. This can be at school, work, and in relationships with others. Next slide, please. So anxiety is a response to a perceived threat. When our brains perceive something as dangerous, our body's alarm is triggered. We experience biological and physiological changes in our bodies, and these signal us to behave in a way to keep ourselves safe. When the threat isn't real or as severe as we think, but our body's alarm is still triggered and we behave in a certain way to stay safe, this is called a false alarm. So students who struggle with anxiety experience many false alarms. Their minds and bodies are on high alert. Their body's alarm can be triggered easier or faster by events that are actually non-threatening, but in which the student feels like they are in real danger. So behavior in these situations can be reinforcing. A behavior such as running out of a classroom gets the student relief because they're able to avoid what caused them to feel anxious. But because their anxiety is then reduced, it also strengthens the belief that the event that caused them to run is actually threatening. Their anxiety makes it difficult for them to slow down their mind and body in situations and conceptualize what is actually happening and effectively cope. Next slide, please. We're now going to view another clip from our Managing Anxiety documentary, and in this clip we hear what some students and families have to say about their experiences with anxiety.
When I'm in a new place or go to places that are really crowded, I start to like fidget with my hands, and like my tongue it'll go in my cheek, and like I'll like bite my fingernails, and like my eyes will get a little watery. And if I don't have my water, then I start to like freak out a lot.
I think Braden copes with his anxiety well now. It's been a journey. So in the younger years, we didn't really know what we were dealing with. So it took some time to figure out, first identify it. Because in the younger years, there was the running away, there was the hiding, there was, taking entire bookshelves of books and just throwing them all to the ground, trying to figure out what was going on internally. And as he got older and was able to talk about his feelings a little more, that made it easier for us to identify how to help him.
When I feel really anxious, my parents know because my face gets not red, but it's not like how I usually look. And I get all emotional, and I get really fidgety, and I just look really scared.
With Kelly, one of the things that I immediately see is, she starts biting on the nails, kind of wondering and asking lots of questions.
She's always scared of the unknown. Mm-hmm. So she wants to know ahead. And knowing ahead calms her down, but at the same time puts her more pressure to us, because she gives us one more question after one more question after one more question of how everything is going to lay out.
Okay, next slide, please. So on the slide, you'll see a list of common signs and symptoms of anxiety. And we've included this list of anxious behaviors in today's webinar to bring attention to the range of manifestations of anxiety. Again, with anxiety, we often see students trying to escape difficult situations by engaging in challenging behaviors. A student's behavior that stems from the anxiety they are feeling can easily be misread as oppositional or defiant. However, students with anxiety can also experience internalizing behaviors such as social withdrawal or somatic complaints. In addition, there's overlap between common symptoms of anxiety and common symptoms of depression, including sleep disturbances, trouble concentrating, and fatigue. So this range of behaviors can make recognizing anxiety in students difficult. As Karen mentioned earlier, it can be easier to recognize behaviors of concern when they are externalizing behaviors versus internalizing behaviors. And the more education staff have on the different manifestations of anxiety, the more likely they are to be able to early identify behaviors of concern. So we invite you to use the information on this slide as a resource for yourself or to share with colleagues. And a takeaway from this is that one student's anxiety can look very different from another student's anxiety. Next slide, please. And I'll turn it over to Karen.
Thanks, Andy. In this section of the training, we're going to discuss school-wide prevention strategies. We will be using clips from our documentary, Managing Anxiety in Childhood and Adolescence, Information for Parents and Caregivers. In this clip from the roundtable discussion, you will hear from 3 educators: Janine Casapula, who is a 3rd grade inclusion teacher; Deanna Florence, who is a pre-K through 5th grade science specialist; and Myra Hyundai, who is an instructional coach who works with high school students. We asked these educators, what strategies do you use to set up the environment to support students who struggle with anxiety? What does your classroom look like so it's a calming space? What daily strategies do you engage in with your students that can reduce anxiety? Next slide, please. So here are the educators talking about their prevention strategies.
In my classroom, one of the first things that we do as part of our community building and introduction into the classroom is we learn sort of simply about what happens in our brain throughout the day. And then also we learn about our emotions, regulating our emotions, what we can do throughout the day to sort of advocate for ourselves when we need certain things to sort of get ourselves back into a good headspace. So we talk about the amygdala in the brain is like the guard puppy. It helps keep us safe from danger, but it's really young and needs to learn. And so sometimes when you feel worried or anxious or silly or excited, your guard puppy is going to start barking, which then affects our memory elephant, which is the hippocampus. And that's a place where things are stored, things we've learned, memories, but the elephant is emotional and can get confused by the guard puppy. The wise owl, which is the prefrontal cortex, helps sort of control the brain. It tells us when to open our eyes. It also tells us how to read and when to solve math problems. And so the wise owl really helps keep everything calm and in order, but sometimes the wise owl also needs some support. And so that's when we teach our students that if it feels like our guard puppy is barking, if it feels like we have some things happening in our body that are not helping us to focus on their work or whatever it is that they're doing, they can then advocate for themselves to take a break in our break space, which in my classroom is called the gas station. So if students feel like they need to sort of pull off the road and pull out of the day to take a break and refuel themselves, they're able to take a few minutes, think about the types of things that they need in that moment, whether they need to move or sit quietly, they need to take some mindful breaths, or they need to squeeze something and touch something. And they then can teach themselves when they need those breaks and really take ownership over themselves and their learning, because we can't have one without the other. We can't learn when our emotions and our bodies are dysregulated.
In my classroom, some of the things that I do to ease anxiety or different emotions that students may be feeling is I also use a calm area, just like Janine had mentioned, her gas station, in the same sense that Students can go there when they're feeling a little anxious or they're unable to name their emotions in that space and take some time to themselves to calm down. I also use a criteria for success to help students know what activities are coming next throughout the class period. And just so that they can keep track of what they're doing and where they are. Some things that I do to keep them calm during independent work would be using the 80 beats per minute music, because that is the resting heart rate for a child. So that music helps to calm them down and center them during the independent activities. And I also offer flexible seating. I don't require students to be always sitting in a desk chair. I do allow them to use cushions on the floor or to just sit on the floor if they choose, to help ease their anxiety during the work time.
Yeah, some of the strategies that I use in a high school classroom are for mainly upper grades, 11 and 12. Definitely rearranging the furniture in a place that it's very open, and that they have choice, like Deanna said. There's different types of chairs. I don't require students to be sitting down all the time at all. I don't think that that impacts my teaching in their learning. So that's a lot of flexibility there. When it comes to academics, I provide my students with a syllabus for the year where things are kind of like where they can tell what's coming, and that's kind of like big picture. But then anytime that we're in a unit, then they also get information about that specific unit. And they also get the assessments ahead of time. I think that helps a lot of students break things down. All the assessments have rubrics, and a big thing that I do in my daily practice is to make sure that students understand the rubric so that rubric can guide some of their academic work. I think that we also, we're really mindful about getting to know each other before the school year starts, and just really try to build a classroom where students feel like they can be themselves and they can be brave and supportive of each other, and that there's space for everyone in it, whether you deal with anxiety or not, and how we can support each other in that process. I think that I try to model a lot of the tools that I use in terms of how I keep my life organized. Sometimes students need a little guidance with that, and we do go through like keeping a planner, either an electronic one or a hard copy, just so that they can really feel like they have a handle on things when things get a little overwhelming.
Next slide, please. So we shared with you a portion of the conversation that the educators had together. And throughout their entire discussion, they shared prevention strategies they use to support all students and those students who struggle with anxiety. On the slide are a few highlights of the strategies that the educators discussed. Building community with and among students so they feel a sense of belonging and safety. Talking with students about their feelings and understanding that when we feel distressed, it's hard to learn. Providing a calm space for students with choices so they can self-regulate. Providing notice of transitions and activities to prepare students of changes in the lesson ahead of time. Knowing transitions for the classroom and the school building can put students at ease. Modeling use of language and of how we feel and how we manage these feelings. This is what Gisela talked about earlier, of how we get anxious at times and how do we show our humanness and model ways to manage these feelings. We have a handout for you in the Google folder about accommodations and interventions in the classroom that we'll share with you at the end of the webinar. Next slide, please. And now I will hand it over to Gisela.
Thank you, Karen. The second question we asked our educator roundtable is what strategies they use in the moment to support students who struggle with anxiety. We will now show you a portion of the roundtable discussion.
Some of the strategies that I use in the moment when students are struggling with anxiety, they really do look different depending on the actual context, because I feel like these things don't manifest all in the same way. And I think that this is another reason why it's really important to get to know your students, because I think that once you do, then you can almost like predict what might be a trigger for students in the classroom. I tried as much as possible to leave my door open to my classroom, and often if I feel or I notice, whether it's because a person voices it or by nonverbal communication, that somebody is in need of some strategies or some space, then I often offer the person to step outside the classroom, not to leave the classroom by themselves, because I don't think that getting somebody outside of the learning community it's always the answer, but getting some air and some space, like we have a window right by the door, that just sometimes it's just really soothing. And I often just try to get to the root of whatever is triggering the student or the reaction. Often it has to do with something that happened in class and an assessment that is coming up, and sometimes it's about other things that are outside of the classroom. And I gauge, what to do next based on their response, right? So it might be like, okay, let's have some water together. Let's, who do you want to talk to? If I know that the conversation is going to need longer than the time that I know I can offer in the moment, then I try to think, okay, who is available that the student can talk to? Because obviously I have to be mindful of the rest of the students in the classroom. And so, yeah, I think that, again, I try to stay very calm, and then just be really mindful about my tone. I try to keep it as private as possible to make sure that the person doesn't feel exposed. And go from there.
Similar to Myra, I think the relationships so that you can anticipate if possible, but sort of react tailored to each student can be helpful. It's not always possible, but also just having options, not too many that's going to feel overwhelming, but my break space that I have in my classroom is available to everyone. Some kids never use it, and some of my students use it multiple times a day. And once they're in there, they have options for what they need. I think also to have sort of collaboration and relationships within the building of different people, teachers that had them in previous years or in the office, or if you can find time with the principal, just having other people that if you need to say like, hey, heads up, I might need 5 minutes if you can spare it, or whatever it is. And I think reflecting on myself in those moments, again, I think to have some kind of like, I can see that you're feeling this way. I'll give you a couple of minutes, staying calm. I tend to talk a lot, so I really have to remind myself to like keep it very simple and short. Just want to make sure that they know I'm there. I can either leave them alone for a couple of minutes and we can be quiet, or I can sort of talk to you. But just really encouraging and empowering that advocacy for when there's moments like this, they can hopefully make a choice of what they might need in that moment. Or if not, I hopefully will have a relationship with them where I can kind of gauge what they need.
I agree with what Myra and Janine said in the beginning, that relationships are very, very, very important to help you de-escalating students in the moment. Those relationships will help you to identify their triggers, and they'll also help you to identify strategies to help them calm down in that moment. But some of the things that I do is I offer my take a break space that has some activities that help kids calm down, including like breathing activities that they can use. I also offer movement breaks in the hallway. They just have small cars that's like do 10 jumping jacks or do some wall push-ups for students who may be outwardly expressing that they're very anxious. But I also use tone and proximity. I tend to be very loud and very movement. I talk with my hands a lot. And so for students, sometimes that can cause them to have anxiety. So I know for some students, I need to make sure that I'm giving them some distance and also not being so loud in their presence, just to calm them down. a bit, and also giving them language, giving them the language of feeling anxious, giving them the language of feeling angry or sad or whatever the emotion is, so that they're able to communicate to others when they're feeling that way. But I also offer a lot of choice. Would you like to take 5-minute break and then come back? Can we revisit in 5 minutes to see how you're feeling? And I try to give choices that are still within the content so that they're not so disconnected when they return to the space.
Next slide, please. Throughout their whole conversation, the educators shared several more strategies they use to support students in the moment. On this slides are a few highlights of the strategies they discussed. Building relationship with the student as the foundation for choosing strategies in the moment. Remembering that strategies depend on the context and are adapted to meet the needs of each individual student. They also share a reminder to stay calm and be mindful of tone of voice and proximity, to help label the experiences of students, and remembering to offer choices for what a student may need in the moment. Educators are always looking to build their strategies, their toolkit, so that they can better support students in the moment. And educators have a variety of tools they can use. They can be empowered to know what to do when faced with the students experiencing anxiety in the moment. Next slide, please. As a way to close this section of supports for students in the moment, let's watch another clip from our documentary. In this clip, students share strategies they have used to help them cope in the moment.
When I'm anxious, what I do to help myself is I do this thing called box breathing, where you breathe in, you make one line of the box, you breathe out, you make another, you breathe in, and then you breathe out until you make a box, and you can keep doing that. Or I do this thing called 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, where you say 5 things you can see, 4 things you can hear, 3 things you can touch, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste.
What I do in the moment to help myself feel better, I usually just take deep breaths or like fidget with my just say like my sleeve or something that will help me calm down. If my brother's around, I'll usually play with him because he helps calm me down. And we have we usually go in the basement and play like soccer or football or foosball or something down there.
And next slide, please. And I will now turn it over to Andy.
Thanks, Gisela. So the third and final question we asked our educator roundtable is how they partner with families to support students who struggle with anxiety. And we will now show this clip.
Families is one of my favorite conversations to have, my favorite topics, because families are so important in our classrooms and they really do impact our students' learning. So building relationships in the same way that we build relationships with our students is so important with families. And some of the ways I do that is I attend arrivals and dismissals every day for our children. I greet every single student by name. I'm in a luxury position that I get to see and teach every student in my school. So I can connect with every single family, and that's great. It's wonderful. But when there is some times that there are cultural or language barriers, I do lean on the support staff that we have here at our school. We have a family liaison that speaks multiple languages. So I do lean on him quite often to help translate to families. But I also make sure that our first interaction that I ever have with the family is one in a positive sense. So I will do brag calls home and let families know how well their students are doing in science, or if I saw them in the hallway doing something great today, I might call home and let that family know, or text through our Talking Points platform and let that family know that their child is doing a great job in school. But I also reach out to see if families have any strategies on helping their kids cope that they might use at home that we could adapt and use in the classroom setting as well. I'm in a unique position because I do attend all school events, even if they are not mandatory, which also helps build those connections with families because I'm always seeing and conversing with them. And I also lean onto classroom teachers. I do not teach a classroom per se because I teach science. I teach every grade in the school. So I do lean on classroom teachers to just hear and see what they're doing in their classroom so that we may use it in science too.
Just like Deanna said, I think that families are an extremely important piece of the puzzle. I don't think that we can have schools without families ultimately, and they're trusting us with taking care of their children, their most precious thing. Like they, it's such an incredible trust to like just leave your child regardless of their age in a space in which they cannot see most of what happens in schools, and students end up spending so much time with us, and I think that because of this, like we just cannot undermine the what it means to have healthy relationships with parents, and we also have to honor their who they are as themselves, like what they bring to our community, because ultimately we are not the experts on their children, they are, and so there's so much we can learn from parents, that we as teachers will never ever be able to know about their children, and so it's really really important to have that partnership. I also think it's really important to be mindful of culture, because not everybody, not every culture sees anxiety the same way, or even understands it the same way, or has the same strategies for it. And so I think that it's important that we identified how families see it and how we can support that learning or unlearning, because a lot of what I see, especially around this topic of anxiety or mental health in general, is that there is a lot of unlearning we have to do, as a community. And so for parents, it's schools, historically, schools have not been so kind to people all the time, and especially public districts, which one that I work at. And so parents might have attended the same school that their children are attending, and their lived experiences can really be the thing that guides that relationship that they have with schools. And so I think it's extremely important to name the fact that there's a lot of trauma in these communities, and that we have to name it in order to actually move forward and create any kind of authentic relationship. And also to just activate the power that families have. They have power. They are not, communities have power. They just need, this power sometimes just needs to be activated. We don't give it to them. They come with it already. And I think that it is our responsibility to make sure that they know their rights, that they know the supports that their families and their children can have, and that we are really consistently giving everything that we can to make sure that their children are taken care of every day, all the time, all of them, in all the environments, no exception.
Okay, next slide, please. So throughout the entire discussion, the educators shared strategies they use to partner with families to support students who struggle with anxiety. On the slide are a few highlights of the strategies they shared. These include viewing conversations with families as learning opportunities, recognizing that families have their own histories and lived experiences with school systems that can contribute to their feelings about schools and the relationships they form with school professionals, and being mindful of all that families have going on personally and professionally. Next slide, please. To wrap up this section on partnering with families, here's another clip from our documentary. In this clip, families share supports their students have received from school.
At school, what's been helpful for Braden to manage anxiety has been his guidance counselor. He has a phenomenal relationship with his guidance counselor, open door policy. Whenever he's struggling or just needs to talk, he will go seek out that counsel. He's also on a 504 plan. So he has a standing desk. He has the ability to go take tests in remote areas out of the classroom. He has the ability to grab fidgets throughout the day. He has the ability to get up and take little walking breaks if he has a little anxiety or feels like he just needs to get out of a situation. So that's been really helpful to allow him to kind of manage it on his own when he feels like he needs a break or needs a quick timeout. He has that ability to go do that.
Kelly has an individualized educational plan, so an IEP. She has had it, for several years, And we have, in this community, we have a very good school system that supports Kelly.
Next slide, please. And I'll turn it back over to Karen.
Thanks, Andy. As we close the webinar today, we want to give a brief summary of what we covered. First, we talked about the importance of self-awareness and the role of culture and how this can contribute to how we understand anxiety and approach supporting students with anxious behaviors. Next, we talked about behavior as a form of communication and looked at the wide range of symptoms of anxiety. We shared that the implications for us as educators is to understand that anxiety can manifest in many ways so that we are responding to anxious behaviors appropriately and effectively. We also heard from students, families, and school staff about how they have managed and coped with anxiety. In closing, we invite you to take a moment to think about one word that describes what the webinar was like for you today. Take a moment to reflect, and if you would like to and feel comfortable sharing, you could do so in Slido. If you left Slido open, it should have advanced to this next question. If not, you can access Slido by scanning the QR code on the slide or by clicking on the link that has been put in the chat. Next slide, please. Now we'll look at my other screen to see what people have shared. Good information. Anything else people want to share about today? Sometimes it's hard to include one word. Maybe you want to include a sentence or a couple of sentences. Informative, stressful, good information, very informative. Liked hearing from teachers. Yes. Beneficial, informative. Thank you, everyone. We really appreciate your participation. Next slide, please. So this is a list of trainings that we will be facilitating over this school year. We hope you will join us. Next slide, please. We want to share links where you can find TAP videos and our pre-recorded webinars from this series. The link to the landing page for this webinar series and the link to all of our TAP resources will be shared in the chat. School communities can click on the Educator and School Professionals link. We released a new video on strengthening teams. Please check that out. And there are other free TAP online trainings, especially designed for educators on that site. Please, next slide, please. Today, we shared clips of students and families talking about their experiences coping with anxiety. And as we mentioned throughout the webinar, these clips were from our documentary on managing anxiety in childhood and adolescence, information for parents and caregivers. And we have a link to the documentary in the chat. We also have a resource guide that you see on the slide that has information on anxiety and resources that parents and educators can use to support students and families. The documentary and the guide are free and downloadable, and we encourage you to share them with colleagues and families. The guide will be part of the Google folder that you will receive in a follow-up email. Next slide, please. Thank you once again, everyone, for spending time with us. We hope this opportunity to learn about and reflect on prevention and intervention strategies for students and their families will support you in your professional role. All the resources we talked about today during this webinar are located in the Google folder for this training. We're sharing the link to the Google folder in the chat for you to save for future reference. You will also receive a follow-up email with the resources and the landing page, which contains all the trainings for this series. If you have any questions about this training, please feel free to reply to the follow-up email. Next slide, please. So in order for you to ensure that you receive your certificate of completion for today's session, you need to complete the survey. You can click on the QR code or the link in the chat to access it, and it takes about 2 weeks to receive your certificate via email. Thank you again, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.